Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time you're tuning in the program called What's Going On FlintTalkRadio.com. I'm George Moss, the host of the program, and I'm very glad to have you with us this afternoon at Flint's best podcast program and production here at Flint.com, FlintTalkRadio.com. And we are going to be talking this afternoon about Dr. Martin Luther King. We're coming to you on the 17th of January, 2011, and if King were alive today, his birthday would have been on the 15th, which would have been Saturday, and King would have been celebrating his 85th birthday. Dr. King was born on the 15th of January, 1929. And so we're going to be talking a little bit about the historical Dr. Martin Luther King, and maybe not so much about the myths that have been created around Dr. King's persona. So as we unravel the real Dr. King, hope you would join in this discussion if you feel the need to call in and share your ideas about Dr. Martin Luther King. This is your day. This is America's day. And we want everybody to feel like this is a part of your history and not just a particular community's history, because King was trying to get the nation to live out the true meaning of his creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. And I want to add, given the fact that we are now some, 47, 48 years now away from the I Have a Dream speech that Dr. King gave in Washington, D.C. on the 28th of August, 1963. I want to say that we ought to also include women as well. So we want to say that the nation to live out its true meaning of its creed, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and all women are created equal. And so I want all of you to feel that you are celebrating this moment in time, this celebration of Dr. King's legacy, because the legacy belongs to all of us. I think that's one reason I was in Washington on the 28th of August last year at the Glenn Beck rally, because I wanted to say that dream that Dr. King had back in 1963 does not just belong to blacks. In fact, when King gave that speech in 1963, 25,000 whites were in the audience at that point in time. As you remember, there were 250,000 persons that showed up in Washington, D.C. on that particular occasion, and 225,000 of those persons were blacks, and 25,000 were white Americans who had joined in this movement. This movement had in it blacks and whites who were in fact fighting for America to rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. And we still hold to those truths, that all men and all women are created equal, and that they are born with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's in the Declaration of Independence for those who may be in Congress thinking that's in the Constitution of the United States. So we come here today to just say, to pay homage to this iconic figure who martyred himself, gave his life for the cause, and seemed to have been prophetically predicting almost his own end as he spoke on the 3rd about going to the mountaintop. And we're going to play that at the end of the program so you can see the comments that Dr. King gave in one of his last speeches. In fact, his last speech, which he gave April the 3rd, one day before the assassination took place. We'll do that at the latter part of the program. I want to try to talk a little bit, though, about the civil rights movement that Dr. King led over the 13 years, the last 13 years of his life. Dr. King starting out his civil rights drama at the age of 26. And it's amazing what he actually accomplished during such a short period of time. Most persons don't accomplish those kinds of things that King accomplished over the course of 4 or 5 decades. And Dr. King accomplished that from the age of 26 to his 39th birthday, 39th year, in which he was assassinated during his 39th year. So it's really interesting to look at the things that were accomplished by this pivotal figure, one of the great figures in the 20th century. With that, there's no question. Let me start out by reading something from one of the books that's been written about King, and there are a lot of books written about King. Some of them more important than others, and I'll give you maybe 4 or 5 of those books. I think we ought to, in fact, start our reading about the legacy of this giant civil rights figure. One of the books, though, is the book written by David Lewis, which, when it was published in 1970, was called King, A Critical Biography. Now the title of the book is King, A Biographical Out, I guess because you can't talk about King in a critical sense, but we need to talk about all aspects of King's legacy, and part of it is the critique of King. He wasn't perfect, he wasn't an angel, so we'll talk about King as the historical figure and not the King that we have in terms of the sanitized version of Dr. King's legacy, because we don't have to sanitize Dr. King's legacy to make it great. It's great in all of its dimensions, the way it actually reads in history, and we need not alter it not one bit. Let me read to you something from David Lewis's book, and I'll read the postscript of the book that came out in 1970, and 10 years later he wrote another postscript to the book. It is called Reflections After a Decade. And here's what David Lewis, this great historian, whom John Hope Franklin called probably the greatest historian in America today, that is plying his trade. And that's quite a bit to be saying that he is one of the greatest historians that's living in the present time, because John Hope Franklin was a great historian in his own right. And for him to acknowledge David Lewis is really saying something, because of the statue that John Hope Franklin occupied as a pioneering historian, the author of the book called From Slavery to Freedom. Well, here's what David Lewis said in his reflections on Dr. King after a decade. He said, it is unlikely that future generations will mature in ignorance of Martin Luther King, but it is now true, even now true, that college history majors are hazy about his significance. Year by year, with each January 15th commemoration of his birth, Martin Luther King recedes deeper into the midst of his mountaintop. He is in danger of becoming a man for all reasons, an elastic fetish, as potent for one cause as for another. If this has been the inevitable fate of historic figures whose lives and messages transcend the parochialism of their time, the nation's canonization of Martin Luther King has nevertheless been rushed to the point of disservice. In a sense, we have sought to remember him by forgetting him. And so we have these memorials every year. You know, the nationalization of his birthday started in it was actually passed by Congress in 1983, and then the actual celebration took place 3 years later, starting in 1986. So we've been at this for a while as far as the national celebration of Dr. Martin Luther King's holiday, his official holiday, from 86 until the present time. But it seems like every year that we celebrate Dr. King, the more we celebrate Dr. King, the more we put him into the midst of that mountaintop, and we are forgetting the legacy and the moment in which Dr. King actually lived. In fact, he's been reduced almost to one speech, and not even the whole speech at that. Maybe a couple of sentences in the speech where everybody knows I have a dream, and beyond that, they can't really figure out what it was that Dr. King was trying to accomplish. So let's go back to the very beginning point and try to bring King's story up to speed so that we can get some sense of what Dr. King was actually trying to accomplish and some of the circumstances Dr. King was addressing and trying to alter and bring about a better result. You have to know something about Jim Crow. That means laws in the books that restricted people's access to certain things, such as public schools, which were segregated. You have to know something about segregation. Schools are segregated, meaning that these schools were in fact departmentalized based upon race, with blacks at that time called Negroes going to the schools where the colored students were going, and whites going to schools where the student body would be all white. And so this segregationist kind of policy in the South, where you had the races were segregated based upon their color, so that there were black schools, or Negro schools, you would call them colored schools, and schools for those who were not colored. And I do remember that in Birmingham when I was coming up, where I had to pass by a school called Woodlawn High School, and we would go past that school 52 blocks away to the school in Smithfield, which was Parker High School. That was a school for some of the black students. Of course, they had Almond School and Western, and they did have one school that was integrated. That was a Holy Family School, which was a Catholic school in Birmingham, where both blacks and whites went to that school. But the public schools were, in fact, segregated. And that's just in Birmingham, but multiply that throughout the South, and you see what was taking place throughout the Southland, where those schools were, in fact, segregated. So Jim Crow laws were on the books, and they had manifested the fact that they had been manifested in the fact that those schools would be segregated by law. In other words, unlawful for blacks and whites to go to the same schools in those southern states. In Montgomery, the way it played out, and also in other parts of the South, was not only in the school systems, but also every facet of Southern life was segregated. You would ride, for example, in the back of the bus. And that is a point of contention that we're going to see play out in several cities, not just in Montgomery, but you had a bus boycott around the segregated buses in Louisiana that went on in 1954, and that bus boycott lasted 2 weeks. But they weren't able to maintain the bus boycott for a considerable period of time, and it didn't really result in the kind of deinstitutionalization of segregation as would happen later on when King would in fact head the movement in Montgomery. But this was a prototype of what was going to take place the following year. So on that day, which was December the 1st, 1955, we find that Rosa Parks is on that bus. And when I ask people, where was Rosa Parks sitting on that bus on December the 1st, 1955, most persons think because the pictorial that they put out there today showing Rosa Parks riding the bus after the bus boycott has successfully ended in the integration of those buses, where Rosa Parks went back on that bus and rode behind the bus driver, and the photographers were there and took a picture of that. Most persons take that picture to assume that that's where Rosa Parks was sitting on the 1st of December, 1955, when she was arrested. Rosa Parks was sitting in the 10th seat of that bus on the other side of the bus driver. The bus driver, of course, sits on the left side of the bus. Rosa Parks was sitting in the 10th seat on the right side of the bus, and you can say, therefore, that Rosa Parks was sitting in the front of the colored section of the bus. In other words, she was actually sitting within the confines what the law would have allowed. She's not, in fact, sitting in the white section of the bus. And on those buses, by the way, what you did, you had, I don't know if they have this in Montgomery, but I can tell you that in some of the cities, certainly in Birmingham, they had it. They had a sign that was they had holes in the metal part of the seat. And it was for you to put the sign that separated the white customers from the black customers from each other. As long as you were sitting behind that sign, you were complying with the state law. And if the bus filled up from the back where the blacks were sitting, and the bus filled up from the back to the front, you just moved the sign to accommodate the additional seating that was necessary for the blacks in the bus. So as long as you sat behind that sign, you were in fact complying with the law. What you could not do, though, is sit in front of that sign that said whites would sit in the front, and the blacks, or it had the word color, the color would sit in the back. As long as you move that sign up, you could sit in that particular seat. Now, when Rosa Parks got on the bus, there were more blacks on that bus than there were whites, and she was sitting in the 10th seat, so she's like in the middle of that bus. And as the bus began to pick up passengers, the bus filled up, and now a white gentleman gets on the bus, and because the bus was filled, Rosa Parks who was sitting in the outside seat. In other words, she was not sitting by the window at this point. She was sitting in the outside seat, and there was a gentleman sitting over next to the window, and there were two women sitting across from her. And the rule was that if you had to accommodate a white passenger, then all four of those persons on that row would have to, in fact, give their seats up. And this would have been to give up their seat to accommodate one white person, because you couldn't have the black sitting on the same level as the white passengers because that implied equality between the races. And so, therefore, to accommodate this one gentleman who got on that bus, you had to, in fact, vacate 4 seats. So the bus driver, whose name was Blake, and a number of people had problems with Blake throughout his tenure as a bus driver. Uh, 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 I think his name was Eugene Blake. Asked his rearview mirror, asked them to give up those seats. And I think that they all knew that they were not out of compliance with the law. They were not sitting in the front of the bus. And now they're asking them for those seats that they were sitting in the color section. So when he first asked for those seats, nobody got up and gave their seats. He asked 2 more times, I'm telling you to get up and give those seats up. And still there was no compliance. Then he says, make it easy on yourself because you're going to give those seats up. And so at that point, the 2 women that were on the other side got up and they started heading to the back. And the gentleman next to Rosa Parks over by the window, he got up and he was getting ready to give up his seat and move to the back of the bus. And what Rosa Parks did is that she slid her legs out into the aisle to let him by. And when he came out of his seat and out of the passage area and was walking to the back, Rosa Parks then slid over to the window and took over his seat and just was not getting up that day. And when he said to her again, I'm asking you to give up those seats. And when Rosa Parks did not comply, the bus driver then got off the bus, went to the telephone, and called the police. And they then came to the bus and asked Rosa Parks why she didn't give up her seat. And Rosa Parks responded that she didn't think that she had to. Now think about that. She didn't think she had to because Rosa Parks was not in defiance of the law. This is the bus driver saying get up. This was not legally what was required. Rosa Parks was sitting in the section assigned to the blacks at this point. And so it wasn't that her feet were hurting, as some pundits have written about. Rosa Parks was in compliance with the law, and she did not feel, and she said this, that I did not feel that I had to. And so when the officer told her that she had to comply with the bus driver, she then asked him, why do you all always push us around? And the officer said, I don't know, but you're under arrest. Now, there are a couple of things going on around this arrest. One of them was this gentleman by the name of E.D. Nixon, who is a black person in Montgomery, Alabama, who works on he's a part of the Sleeping Car Porters and Maid Union that had been set up by Asa Philip Randolph in 1925. And E.D. Nixon, who was a 3rd grade, I think he had finished 3rd grade. I know he had not finished more than 6th grade. So he was not a tutored person, but he was a person who had been in the community all of his life and was one of those pillars of the community who saw an opportunity here. And when he found out that Rosa Parks had been arrested not for disorderly conduct, but had been arrested for defying the segregation laws of Alabama, E.D. Nixon said, we finally got him. We finally got the test case that we're looking for. Now, previous to the arrest of Rosa Parks, on the 1st of December 1955, they had arrested another person on the bus for not giving up her seat, and her name was Claudette Colvin, who was a 15-year-old teenage young lady going to school, public school, and she had defied the laws also and had been arrested. They thought about the bus boycott around her arrest, but then they found out that she was not the kind of person that they wanted to actually rally the community around because she was carrying a little bit of heavy baggage, part of which was she was pregnant at the time. And also she was a little bit more profane than what they were looking for as a model to rally the community around a bus boycott. So then it went through the cracks, so to speak, and they did not, in fact, organize it around Claudette Colvin's arrest. But they could have done it before that, as a matter of fact, because there was also a person at Alabama State College by the name of Ann Robertson. Ann Robertson was an English teacher at Alabama State College, and when she had come out of Cleveland and was sitting in the front of the bus, and she had some problems on the bus as well, they could have actually organized it around that time, but the moment wasn't right for it. But in 1955, there had been a person coming into the city by the name of Dr. Martin Luther King, who had just now completed his work on his doctorate degree at Boston University. And this timing and this person there at that moment in time, those two energies meeting was the catalyst that's going to make a difference in this particular arrest as opposed to some other arrests that had been made and who had not had problems on those buses, because most of the persons on those buses were blacks who didn't have cars. And they were going to their domestic jobs and their jobs as janitors and things like that, having the lowest jobs in the city because of segregation policies. They were the ones who were riding those buses. And so who hadn't had a bad experience on the bus? Well, Rosa Parks was the secretary of the NAACP. And when they arrested Rosa Parks, the word got out that Rosa Parks, who was a pillar in the community, highly respected, secretary of the NAACP, had been arrested, and some of the person was saying when they'd heard she'd been arrested, said, they're messing with the wrong one now. They've arrested the wrong one. And so E.D. Nixon sees his opportunity and goes to talk to Rosa Parks and asked her if, first of all, he bails her out, but he asked her if she would be willing to be a test case. And after talking over with her husband, Rosa Parks agreed. There's also, and I can't think of the name of this family in Virginia Durr is the name. Virginia Durr was a liberal that had moved to Montgomery from some state in the north and was there. She was like an advisor to E.D. Nixon, who was trying to get things done on behalf of the black community in the South and trying to end some of the segregationist policies in the South. Virginia Durr was kind of like an advisor in that community, trying to, behind the scenes, work toward the ending of these Jim Crow laws, these restrictions placed upon the citizenship of the quote-unquote color community of the Negroes in Montgomery and other parts of the South. And he called up Virginia Durr, and they were talking about it, and they both agreed that this could be the test case they'd been looking for, and if the people would be willing to stay together, they could, in fact, take this case to court and try to get the segregationist policies, at least in this particular domain, removed. There was some reason to believe that this was the moment because the year before, you recall that the Brown versus Board of Education case that had been handed down by the Supreme Court in a 9-0 unanimous verdict said that segregationist school practices were, in fact, unconstitutional. And so there was some momentum building to make it appear that maybe the time had finally come to test these laws in a court of law. And so on the 1st of December, when Rosa Parks was arrested, they decided then, we're going to call for a boycott on the day in which Rosa Parks' trial comes up, which would have been the following Monday, since Rosa Parks was arrested on Thursday evening around 6 o'clock in the evening. They decided to call a bus boycott for the day in which Rosa Parks' trial will be held, to make a statement about the black community being in solidarity with Rosa Parks' arrest, and was in fact asking for justice and asking for for her not to be found guilty of having violated the laws of Alabama. Well, Rosa Parks was found guilty and fined $5 for violating the laws, which she refused to pay. And so that she was bailed out of the jail pending the appeal, and then the boycott, which was going on for one day, and they were trying to meet with the city fathers because they didn't feel they could keep the people off that bus for a long period of time, because people were riding the buses to work, and they were many of them were working across towns. How do you keep them off the buses, given the fact there was a need for public transportation? So the leadership, of which King was finally designated as the leader, not initially, but after going through some of the others, and it did not work out because there was a lot of animosity going on between the ones that were chosen. They then turned to this young upstart who had just come into the city of Montgomery, didn't have any enemies like some of the others who had been there for a while had, and was really an unknown quantity at that point. They then turned to King for the leadership. And so they called for the bus boycott, and they didn't think it was going to last for any time. And when they got up that morning to find out if people riding the buses, they found that the first bus, King got up, he and his wife Coretta got up and looked through the windows, through the blinds, and lo and behold, the bus was empty. And they got very excited about that because it looked like the bus boycott was going to actually hold for a while. Then the second bus came by, and a third bus. Each of those buses was empty, and that's when they realized that, hey, we got something going here. In fact, boycotting that bus, and they really are going to stay off that bus. Now, how long? That was another question. But for that particular day, they were in fact off those buses and were in fact boycotting the bus. Now, how did they find out about the bus boycott? Well, some of it came about through the fact that they had a friend on the Montgomery Advertising newspaper. I think his name was Atwell. I could be wrong about that. Something like that. One of the reporters was friendly to the movement. There were some people that in the South that wanted to end these accommodation practices that were unfair to part of the citizenship. And E.D. Nixon called him and said, "There's a rumor going around there's going to be a bus boycott." So that Sunday, the Montgomery Advertiser had an article on the front page that was raising the question of, is there a boycott pending in Montgomery? And now a lot more people are aware of it. And then Ann Robinson, I just mentioned her name a few minutes ago. Ann Robinson, the English teacher at Alabama State University, had her students staying up all night, and they ran out 35,000 handbills, and they went out there and passed those out, running it off on the mimeograph machine of the university. If they had found that out, knowing how their money is coming from the state coffers, being a state university, if they had found out that one of their staff members was putting them in harm's way that way, I'm sure Ann Robinson would have been dismissed, but it wasn't something that you went out there and acknowledged. They had 35,000 handbills they passed out among the citizens in Montgomery, had the students passing those handbills out. And so the word got out that there was a boycott. And so it was not surprising that people were aware of it. What was surprising was that they were actually following through in terms of walking to their jobs that day. Now, the question is, how long will they do that? Now, what King thinks that they need to do is take the energy that they have right now and run to the city fathers and try to get some concessions made before the blacks get back on that bus. In other words, use the bus boycott and then go in there and ask for some things that would, in fact, make some concessions. And they were asking for very mild things. Basically three things. People sit on those buses on a first come, first served basis. That was one demand. Another demand is that the patrons on those buses be treated with courtesy. And then a third demand, which was black bus drivers on predominantly black routes. In other words, when you are taking passengers to the black community, you'd have black bus drivers. The city fathers could have gotten the boycott ended by just simply giving in to what really were very minor demands, not anything that was revolutionary. These are very minor things that were being asked for. But if you give in, the idea is if you give in under this kind of duress, then the city fathers are not really in control after all, and you're encouraging other demands to be made later on if you give in. So they stood resolute on the fact that no concessions would be made. And now the question would be whether or not they can hold those blacks off those buses. They wanted to just, after about 3 days, they wanted to capitulate and try to just get something out of the deal. Maybe just the courtesy would be a way of getting a concession. It was E.D. Nixon who jumped up in the meeting when he saw they were trying to find a way out of the bus boycott, because if the bus boycott had ended without them getting anything, it would have been discredited. It would have discredited their leadership, because here you are claiming that you have control of the Montgomery constituency, and they're back on those buses. So what are you talking about, and who were you to make those demands in the first place? Well, E.D. Nixon jumped up in the meeting. He said, "You're going to stand up and defend these people in Montgomery, because they're the ones who are paying your salary, the ones that have those dinners they cook on Sundays at these churches, and now you ministers can do something for them, and you're going to do it." And Nixon won the day, and they decided the bus boycott would be continued. and it was continued. Unbelievably, to look back at it now and see how long that bus boycott went on, where people did not ride those buses for 381 days. That's more than 1 year, where people, in fact, were walking to work. Some of them would turn their cars into cabs. People would drive their cars, and as they were going to work themselves, they'd pick up people along the way. Most of them walked, though. Most of them just walked for that more than 1 year period of time. That 381 days, most of them were walking to their jobs and walking back home when their jobs were over, because they believed that this cause was, in fact, just. Plus, they believed in the legitimacy of the leadership. And you cannot even imagine the strain that Martin Luther King was under at that point. But you get some sense of it by the fact that while that bus boycott was going on, Martin Luther King's house was in fact bombed, and people in the South, had arms, and they went home to get their weapons. And Martin Luther King, after his house was bombed, came to the front porch to speak to those who had gone home and gotten their weapons. And Martin came out on the front porch and told them that he did not want them to respond with any kind of violence. He wanted them to take their arms home, and this is going to be a peaceful demonstration, that he was not going to allow this movement to resort to the use of violence. I mean, why are you imitating the conduct we're trying to change? And so Martin sent them back home. And the nonviolent movement, if there was any doubt about Martin's commitment to it, at that point, with his own home being bombed, his family being put in harm's way, if there was any doubt about Martin's commitment to the nonviolent cause, I think it was ended at that particular point in time in 1956, because it's 56 at this point, with the bombing of Martin's home. And there were other bombings that took place as well. Ralph Abernathy's church, the first National Baptist Church, which Ralph Abernathy, his right-hand man, had. They were at a meeting, and Ralph Abernathy got a phone call, and they said, "Ralph, we wanted to call you and tell you that your church has been bombed." And so there were bombings taking place. But they were committed to the idea that they are not going to resort to the same tactics that were being used against them. And that moral climate they created, people could respond to that. These were church people and law-abiding citizens in Montgomery. And they were not going to buy anything along the lines of being made to be violent. They were coming out of a Christian context. Love your enemy as you love yourself. And so what Martin was saying, steeped in the church as it was something they could actually hold on to. And they believed in those principles, and therefore were able to rally around it and stand up for justice, stand up for justice, so to speak. Well, 381 days later, with them not riding those buses, the bus boycott ended. Now, there's a little bit of confusion about what brought it to an end. What brought the bus boycott to an end was that while they were actually walking to their jobs and so on, the NAACP, which was the legal arm of the civil rights movement, it litigated different court cases. While Dr. King was leading the bus boycott, they took this case to court. And it was really the NAACP that actually got the court to sign a decree that segregation on the city buses was a violation of the equal protection law found in the 14th Amendment. So in a sense, it was not the bus boycott that actually ended the segregation legally in Alabama. It was really the NAACP's thrust, although King got a lot of the credit for it. And that, by the way, will cause a lot of tension between the NAACP and Dr. King's SCLC movement. The NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, had been founded in 1909, and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference that had been founded in 1957, 1958, which was seen by the NAACP leaders as an upstart organization that just started like last week, and here they were around for 40 some odd years before the SCLC was founded, and they felt that King was somewhat taking over the legitimacy of this movement that they had been over for so long as a primary and principal civil rights organization. So there's a little bit of tension developing in this movement. But when the bus boycott ended, whoever the credit goes to for having brought it to a close, King's star is now rising. It's out of Montgomery then that King's leadership is established, and then setting up the SCLC 2 years after the bus boycott had been enjoined. Where you now have a movement throughout the South. King's star is, in fact, the style that everybody is paying attention to. He goes into Birmingham, and Birmingham, out of Birmingham comes the March on Washington, and King gives the I Have a Dream speech for the third time. Well, 5 years in, we get to Memphis, and Dr. King has led a demonstration on the 28th of March, 1968. And this march turned into violence. We now know that in that march, in a group called the Invaders, we now know that march had been infiltrated by people that were working inside of the power structure. And they had infiltrated that group to make that march King led it turned into violence. Windows being broken out, and there was King in the front of this march, and this march broke into violence. King couldn't believe the glass being broken and stores being looted. It was an incredible event. Here was the heir of Mahatma Gandhi's nonviolent program, and here was a man who was in the image of Gandhi, the one that was carrying the passive resistance nonviolent struggle throughout the South, leading a demonstration that broke out in violence. Dr. King is ushered into a car, and he leaves the scene, pretty much leaving the violence that had broken out, left the scene. And then the papers are putting in the next day, the papers said here was King running away from a demonstration that he was leading that led into violence, and he was fleeing the scene from the incident that he had in fact caused. Well, we now know that King had felt compelled to go back into Memphis because Martin had to demonstrate that he could still lead a nonviolent movement, and that nonviolence was not dead, that the militants who were rising up, having listened to Malcolm X and other voices, those persons, the Panther Party that had been founded in 1966, and other militants. And Dr. King had to prove that he still had control over the civil rights movement, and it wasn't going to be vacated to those who were talking about a more militant direction that the movement would go into. And so King had to go back into Memphis. Now, when King went back to Memphis on April the 3rd, the weather was very bad that day, and Dr. King didn't think anybody was going to show up at this church, so he sent his surrogates down there to speak. He told Ralph, he said, "Ralph, you go down there to speak." And Ralph and Jesse Jackson went to the church, and rather than a sparse crowd that they found there were 2,000 people in that church. And Ralph Abernathy went to the phone and said, "Martin, we thought there was going to be a sparse crowd here, but there are 2,000 persons in this church, and this is your crowd, and they came to hear you. They're not going to allow anyone else to speak in your place, and you need to come down here." Martin tells Coretta that he guessed he will go down to the church, and that's where Dr. King will give his mountaintop speech. We're going to show two different versions of it. We're going to show one in which Dr. King is simply speaking at the church, and then we're going to show another one where some of his mentors who are around him at that time will give their reading of that speech and what occurred before he got to the church and put some historical context to it. But here is Dr. King giving his mountaintop speech, April the 3rd, 1968.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
I don't think any of us can be satisfied in the United States until that war is brought to an honorable end.
That was Dr. King the day before he was assassinated, and he said that some began to talk about the threats that were out. When King came into Memphis on the 3rd of April, they had delayed his plane because there was a bomb threat that had been out. And so Dr. King's plane had been delayed, and he was delayed in coming into Memphis because there were threats. But these threats were nothing new for Dr. King. King had been under threat for 13 years. You can't even imagine the kind of stress that Dr. King was under. And I would like to have you read something from Ralph Abinet's book about that, because Ralph Abinet talks about Dr. King's stress level and when they went to Jamaica for a chance to get away from some of the hazards that Dr. King was under, some of the threats that Dr. King was under for that 13-year period of time. And I won't spoil your reading, just want to ignite your interest to go and read about how Dr. King succumbed to some extent to that pressure in terms of how it had really unsettled King, because King was under tremendous stress. You can't even imagine the stress. And what I really admire about it is that, given the fact that many persons that were of lesser stature than Dr. King was and had lesser commitment than Dr. King had would have succumbed to that stress, would have just simply said that they've done their work, I have paid my dues, and walk away from the struggle and go ahead and take on the entitlements. King didn't do that. And I think that's why we have to come around his birthday and acknowledge that this was a major and a very significant contribution that was in fact made, an unusual contribution that was made, that very few persons could have in fact done that, withstanding that kind of stress. Well, let's see, here's a video. We showed you Dr. King's speech itself, but I want to put it within context. And so what we have here at the studio is another film that gives you the same speech, but is also wrapped around some other persons commenting about how it was that last day before Dr. King's assassination took place. And here are some of the ones around King, King's aides, who are discussing this great man.
I was on a train coming back from Nashville.
I was in Indianapolis, Indiana, campaigning with Robert Kennedy.
Sitting in the home of Ralph and Myrtle Ivey watching NBC News.
I was sitting in the Marriott Hotel in Atlanta.
I was at my home on Larchmont Drive in Atlanta.
40 years ago, we invited Martin Luther King to come to Memphis.
I had spent the day in court testifying in support of the sanitation workers in Memphis.
I was a reporter on the staff of the New York Times newspaper.
I had the great privilege of spending the last hour of his life on earth.
This was really my first major assignment in the South.
It was three guys hanging out.
My whole day was built around, I'm going to have another interview with Dr. King today.
After spending the day in the courtroom, came back.
And one of Martin's favorite story was, and favorite phrases was, "Where is Andy?" You know, has anybody seen Andy?
He said, "Where have you been? Don't you leave me here. I'm the leader of this movement. You have to keep me informed. I bet you've been slipping off around here somewhere." And he just went off.
He was in a great mood, lighthearted.
It was getting late in the afternoon.
And then he picked up a pillow off the bed and threw it at me. And then the next thing I know, everybody was grabbing pillows.
Finally, I'm beginning to see that we're not going to have a chance to talk.
They were getting ready to go to dinner at Billy Kyle's house.
And he knocked on the door and said,
"Guys, come on, let's go.
You all are not ready yet. It's almost 6 o'clock.
We have a rally tonight after dinner."
He left his room and went upstairs to put on a shirt and tie.
And Ralph and Martin wore Aramis cologne. They were known by that Aramis.
And he said, "Martin, I forgot to put my cologne on."
Ralph stepped back in the room.
We were up on the balcony.
I was down in the parking lot.
He's here and I'm here.
I was talking about in my room, smoking cigarettes.
And I was out there boxing with James Orange.
He saw Jesse Jackson. He said, "Jesse, you're not dressed for dinner." Jesse said, "I don't need a shirt and tie. I have an appetite. That's all I need."
They were about to leave, and they had said that it was cool and he probably needed a coat.
And I said, "You better go back and get a coat. You've had a cold."
So I turned and walked away to go down the stairs.
It was almost like he said, "I don't really need a coat, do I?"
And by the time I got 5 or 6 steps,
And he lifted his head like that to sort of test the wind.
The shot rang out.
I thought, it was a firecracker.
And I thought I heard a rifle shot.
Kapow!
And I dashed to the door.
People were ducking behind cars.
I see these people off to my right, a little cluster of people over there, and they're jumping up and down.
It was pandemonium.
And then I turn around, and when I turn around, then I can see Dr. King's laying there on the balcony.
He had been knocked from the railing back onto the floor of the balcony.
I ran up the balcony and ran across to where Martin Luther King was.
The police started to run this way.
And when I got there, the only person there was Reverend Abernathy, and he had a towel.
And I ran up the stairs.
I knelt down beside him, and
he was flat on his back in a pool of blood.
And I'm looking in Dr. King's face, and I see this massive wound, big as your fist.
And the bullet had just, I don't want to describe it.
The bullet had hit him right here on the tip of his chin, and it just took half of his neck off.
I'd never seen anything like it.
I don't think he even heard the shot or felt any pain.
I knew that this was very serious.
And it was obvious to me that he was gone.
And the police were coming, and I hollered to them, "Call an ambulance on your police radio. Dr. King has been shot."
So I ran off the balcony, ran down to that payphone.
And they said, "Where did the shot come from?"
We were telling the policeman to go back over there. We didn't know where the bullet came from.
But the distance wasn't that far.
Some people said they thought they saw smoke coming from the bushes.
You didn't have to be an expert. It wasn't that far.
I got my office in New York on the phone, and I gave him the first reports from the Lorraine.
He and Bernard decided they were not going to leave him when the paramedics came.
And we waited, and we waited.
And Ralph kept holding his head. "Martin, it's Ralph. It's going to be all right. It's going to be all right. It's going to be all right."
Finally, the word came that we lost him. Maybe 3 or 4 hours later, we lost him. From laughter to tears in a millisecond.
they lost Dr. King after being in that room where you heard where Andy Young, they were saying they were throwing pillows around and so on. Really, what he had told Andy Young, who had come back from someplace nobody had known where Andy Young had been, he really said to Andy Young, where you been, Tom? Because they thought that he was the one that was in the movement that was kind of shaky. And so when he would go off, they would just have all kinds of doubts about what was he doing and why wasn't he with the movement at that point in time. It wasn't Andy Young, by the way, that was in fact a plant inside that movement. There were some plants in that movement, but not Andy Young was not one of them. And we do have some names of those that were inside that movement that were in fact working as undercover, agents in that movement. They were on the payroll, so deeply embedded that they were getting their checks by way of as a post office worker check kind of coming through rather than as a check directly from the FBI and so on. So we know there were persons inside of that movement. When Dr. King was assassinated, I think everybody that was up and around and knew about this movement can tell you where they were at that point in time. And here's the way it came across on the airwaves as we listened to Walter Cronkite announcing the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Here's how it played out on April the 4th, 1968.
Direct from our newsroom in Washington, in color, this is the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite and Russ Hodge in Memphis, Tennessee, Dan Rather in New York, Bernard Kalb in Saigon, Marvin Kalb in Wellington, New Zealand, and Bert Quint in Quezon, South Vietnam.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene. Officers also reportedly chased and fired on a radio-equipped car containing 2 white men. Dr. King was standing on the balcony of a second-floor hotel room tonight when, according to a companion, a shot was fired from across the street. In the friend's words, the bullet exploded in his face. Police, who have been keeping a close watch over the Nobel Peace Prize winner because of Memphis' turbulent racial situation, were on the scene almost immediately. They rushed the 39-year-old Negro leader to a hospital where he died of a bullet wound in the neck. Police said they found a high-powered hunting rifle about a block from the hotel, but it was not immediately identified as the murder weapon. Mayor Henry Loeb has reinstated the dusk-to-dawn curfew he imposed on the city last week when a march led by Dr. King erupted in violence. Governor Buford Ellington has called out 4,000 National Guardsmen. And police report that the murder has touched off sporadic acts of violence in a Negro section of the city. In a nationwide television address, President Johnson expressed the nation's shock.
America is shocked and saddened by the brutal slaying tonight of Dr. Martin Luther King. I ask every citizen to reject the blind violence that has struck Dr. King, who lived by nonviolence.
Dr. King had returned to Memphis only yesterday, determined to prove that he could lead a peaceful mass march in support of striking sanitation workers, most of whom are Negroes. Dr. King had this to say last night about the situation in Memphis.
Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest for right.
There was shock in Harlem tonight when word of Dr. King's murder reached the nation's largest Negro community. Men, women, and children poured into the streets. They appeared dazed. Many were crying. A young Negro said Dr. King didn't really have to go back to Memphis. Maybe he wanted to prove something.
And what Dr. King had to prove, of course, was that the nonviolent movement was not dead. and is not dead. It still lives in those of us who are here in 2011. Let me leave you with a couple of ideas and maybe some books we can go and read, because we have to get more familiar with this movement and some of the things that have happened in the aftermath of Dr. King's death. There's a book out written by Ralph Abernathy, and I would suggest when Ralph Abernathy wrote the book, a lot of his critics came out and jumped all over Ralph Abernathy for telling some of the inside secrets of the movement. They thought he was, in fact, desecrating the name of Dr. Martin Luther King. Here's what Dr. Abernathy said in response to those that criticized the initial publication of the book called And the Walls Came Tumbling Down. He says, the firestorm of controversy that greeted the publication of this book, I believe, arose because I wanted to portray Martin as a believable human being. In doing so, I had to deal with certain personal weaknesses. I'll let you go and discover